Hello everybody, thank you for coming. We're really excited to kick off our Turbeville speaker series for this year with Dr. Sam Steen. I'm Dr. Andrea Romero, professor in Family Studies Human Development and director of the Francis McClelland Institute. So thanks for coming. I always want to remind us that we are very honored to carry forward Francis's legacy of talking about and understanding resilience in the lives of children and families. She was a really wonderful business leader, a philanthropist, and she always advocated for more research in this area. We also are very grateful to Pamela Turbeville, who has sponsored this series for many years now. She was a University of Arizona alumni. She won the CALS Alumni Achievement Award, and she still is very active business leader nationally and internationally. And today we have Dr. Sam Steen, who we're very glad has joined the University of Arizona in the last year. He's associate professor in disabilities and psychoeducational studies in the College of Education. He's the director of the counseling program. He describes himself as a counselor educator and a practitioner researcher. So we're very excited to have someone who is going to be talking about really putting research into practice and what that looks like in school systems. And he's going to be telling us a little bit about his work that he's done looking at school-based counseling interventions. His research also looks at issues related to training and preparation of pre-service counselors. So before I turn it over to him, I have one very brief announcement. We have a methods workshop coming up, and so Dr. Katie Zeiders is going to give you a little bit of details.
Hi. Yes, it's put on by the FMI. We are hosting Dr. Ryan Walters on October 6th. This is a Friday from 8 a.m. to 2:30. It's a workshop focused on longitudinal modeling. So if you have data that you have assessed individuals over a period of time, usually 2 to 3, at least 3 waves of data, and you're not sure how to model that, not sure how to include time varying or time invariant predictors, he will walk us through that. It's a day-long workshop. It's also relevant for data that may be clustered. So if you have students nested within schools, nested within districts, that's also something he will be talking about. It is $35 for students or postdocs and $70 for faculty. And if you're interested and haven't seen a link or a flyer, come up to me after. I'm happy to email you. We try to circulate it as well across the university. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sam Steen, as Dr. Romero just mentioned, and today I'm going to be talking to you about school counselors and group work. Group counseling is one role that school counselors use in school settings, and I believe it's something that can be tapped into to make a larger impact in the school. So I passed out 2 index cards. I don't know if it made it all the way around the room. There's a stack in front of the young woman right there. Take 2. The first one, I want you to write down something you hope to learn from this workshop. That's like our pre-assessment. And then the other one is, if you have a questioning along the way, please jot it down, because I likely won't stop and ask for questions, because I like to talk and we could just have a dialogue about one slide the entire time. So write down your questions, and then at the end you can rapid fire them or take them with me. That will be quite helpful. So today I hope to talk to you about a definition of education reform and social justice. I like to think how this work impacts, and to examine traditional school counselors. When you were growing up, you heard guidance counselors, and now we use the word school counselors to be more intentional about the work that we're doing. Briefly, to describe some data that highlights how important education is. We all know this, but seeing it in terms of hard data is important, but also looking at the college access gaps. That kind of lays a foundation and rationale for this work. And then to describe in detail, to the extent possible, my work, group counseling in particular, but then also how this work can be applied in schools K through 12. So my first job as a school counselor was in elementary school. Right before I graduated, I had the luxury of being an intern who was getting paid. So thrown in the fire very early on. I was getting a master's degree at the College of William and Mary. And even at such a highly, I guess it's elitist type school, we were trained really well. It was still a traditional training. Similar to the way we train our school counselors here at this point, where we're learning how to deal with mental health issues. We're learning how to do counseling skills, but not really understanding the educational context. So traditionally, at that time, I was to keep track as an intern, first job, if you will. How many students did I see? What types of programs was I running? How much time did I spend with the kids? And then at the end, to just kind of collate that data. But as you can see, that data is not that helpful. It's just how much work was I actually doing. And the truth be told, one school counselor to a certain number of schools, the ratio recommendation is 1 to 250. And if you know anything about schools, even in this area, the ratios are much higher than that. So imagine just trying to keep track of all that information, but just to justify keeping the job. There was a point in time where school districts had the choice between having a school counselor or a reading specialist at the elementary level. Does that even make any sense? But we had to justify, hey, this is how much work I was doing. I was lucky because I worked in a public school for a few years, decided to go back for a PhD. I was living in Northern Virginia. It's very expensive. If you get a PhD as an educator, you get in a different lane, and so you get pay raise. So that's why I went back. But when I interviewed for the PhD, truth. But when I went back and interviewed for the PhD, I said, hey, yeah, one day I want to be a faculty member just like you. I want to write and do research and all this stuff, but really I wanted to get a pay raise. So while I went through the program, I was lucky because my advisor at George Mason University had just come from Ohio State. And Ohio State was a university that just won one of these DeWitt Wallace Reader Digest research funds or grants that collaborated with the Education Trust, if you're familiar with that institution. They are focused primarily on closing achievement gaps. How do we use data to close achievement gaps, primarily focusing on low-income students and students of color? So I was going through a PhD program and then started applying this knowledge that I was learning in a school setting. It wasn't very easy, but I started to think about things much differently. So no longer just a therapist in a school setting, but how could I actually make an impact on a broader level? And this grant the purpose was to transform counselor preparation programs so that we would become well-versed in the education conversation, so that we were no longer just counting how many students we were seeing, but what sort of impact we were making. So then, when we define education reform, we look at what impact do our programs make at various levels. It's no longer just a school counselor coming in seeing students, but how do we take into consideration the ecological situations or perspective that's going on in the community? How about we target the students who are most at risk of school failure, not just the kids who already have it? So you might say, well, that's not fair. Every student could benefit from a counselor, certainly. But many students, even without a counselor, will still be successful. And I wonder if, in fact, I could ask you, as a high school student at the time, how many times did you go and see your counselor? 0.
I don't think one exists now.
Often? Twice? It's a range. One time for me, and the guy called me to his office, and he said, hey, you're pretty smart. You should apply for this scholarship at this private Catholic school in Baltimore. And I said, great. And so I did. And that was the only school I applied to. I never met that guy. And I believe it's challenging when you think about it. It was 1993. So what was going on then? Political change was going on. We started having conversations about high stakes testing and so forth. So I got lucky that they saw fit for me to go there. My GPA was only a 3.41. There were only 2 assessments that they focused on for SAT, It was reading and language arts. My language arts score was 450. My reading and math. My math score was 500. So I was lucky that I was on the cusp. So here we are in this midst of education reform where we're no longer just trying to look at the kids who have the information. We're also trying to target kids who are marginalized, who are often overlooked. Social justice can be defined. It's kind of complicated. In the teacher prep, I think we've moved a much further along in this conversation, but in school counseling we have a ways to go because we speak in broad terms, but it's not in a way that's measurable, in a way that you can really apply it. So you can say, well, what does social justice mean? If I were to ask you, what does it mean? We'd have a whole list of ideas. In my mind, it means that all of the groups can no longer be looked at in the same way. And that's okay. That's not being racist. That's just being intentional. And not that we look at them in the same way, but everyone doesn't need the same information either. So if we target certain groups and provide access or provide resources to them in a way that we don't necessarily do for another group, it doesn't mean we're taking something away from another group. The group doesn't need it. So the school counseling rhetoric changed through that grant I mentioned. So we used to have a traditional approach where we would count how many students we were seeing. We would use labels. We might focus on individual students. But we moved from that to now look at the system. And that's where the biggest change has occurred. And I think as long as we continue in that way, we're going to make a lot more progress. But schools and counselor education programs and teacher prep programs, I'm not sure you have this problem here, Dr. Romero, but we are slow to change. So although we have these great ideas, right, and school counselors are being trained in these mental health counseling focused situations, they're going and being placed into school and educational environments. And if you're an intern, I see my intern student shaking their head, yes. If you're an intern and you go in and you say, my professor said I need to come in here and be a social justice advocate and change the world, they're looking at you like, what are you talking about? File this paperwork. Or what are you talking about? Help me build this schedule, right? There are these things that we just really still have to do. But the point here is that as we begin to utilize data, then we have another opportunity to really make an impact. So data in a broad sense, data in a specific sense, that's targeted to seeing how much work you're actually accomplishing. So this quote here says, if we continue doing the same things in the same way, we're going to get the same results. I like to have school counselors reflect on these things. I think they became very important to me. I went to public school here in the U.S., pre-K through second grade. My father was in the Air Force. So from the second grade, we left and moved to Germany. And to the 8th grade, I was in schools overseas, but they were American schools. I didn't really think, I loved school. I ran to school. I couldn't wait to get there. I sat up front. People might say you're a nerd, right? But I realized the older I get, we're scholars. So just remember that. There's a big difference, right? But nonetheless, I sat in front, raised my hand. I would do those things. Then in the 8th grade, we came back to the U.S., Newport News, Virginia. It's a very clear community. It's very black and it's very white. There's a large military population in certain pockets that helps. But other than that, pretty much just maintaining the status quo. So I remember vividly 3 different teachers on the same team, because in middle school we had teams, like the students would go through the same teachers. And the first one was my language arts teacher. She calls me into the hallway and says, hey, little Sammy, did you do your homework? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, I already turned it in. She said, no, did you do your homework? I said, yeah, whatever. And so I didn't know what that meant, but I just sat back down. Okay. Same day, another teacher, it was science. And this was an African-American woman. Calls me in the hallway and said, hey, little Sammy, did you do your homework? And I said, well, yeah, what are you talking about? I heard this earlier. She's like, no, but did you do it? Because it's so well written, I'm wondering if your parents helped you. At that time, I chuckled because I said the last time my parents helped me with my homework was literally in kindergarten. I mean, I don't remember them helping. Third teacher, I don't remember if it was the same day or not, but it was the math teacher and asked me the same thing. Did you do this homework? I can reflect on that now and understand sort of the problem with those conversations. But at the time, because I was okay with education, it didn't seem strange to me really that they were asking. It wasn't a risk factor for me. But one of my best friends in that school that year, he ended up getting suspended. African American kid, and we were good friends, and they often wondered, the teachers, why are you hanging out with him? And I'm like, because we're friends. But come to find out, he took teacher's set of keys, threw them on top of a building. Right last year, the year before I got there, so he was a bad kid. And who knows what his experience was elementary, pre-K through this 8th grade year. So it was very different for me. So the point here is I like to have students reflect on why you became a school counselor. Some might argue, oh, Dr. Steen, you're an African American male, so you can do this work. Sure, but I don't only work with black kids. And if we wait until every educator matches the demographics that we see in our school districts, where we're going to be? It's going to take a long time because the discrepancy is growing more and more. So now we want students to not just think about themselves, but how they can become instrumental in engaging others in this work beyond just themselves, right? So I can't do this work alone. That's where the community comes in. School counselors can't just do this work by themselves. That's where the partnerships are important. But we reflect on why we engage in this work, and then what personal and professional risk am I willing to take? Because this work is not for the faint of heart. And you can't really go in there and wreak havoc. I joke about this all the time. If you're going to be in a community 1 year, fine, go into a school and talk about all the inequities and all the policy issues and just wreak havoc and blow the school up and then get the hell out of Dodge. But if you're going to build a community, you're going to be there, you have to build relationships and take time. But there are some professional and personal risks that come along with that. Another side note, we have students in here who have put together Counselors for Social Justice. It's part of an American Counseling Association division at this level, and that work is very tiring and at times overwhelming, but they're willing to make these personal and professional sacrifices in order to engage in that work. So now I hope you can see this slide. So education pays. Sometimes I believe I personally even forget why our kids going to school. We have this national push called Reach Higher initiative that stemmed from Michelle Obama. It was a huge undertaking. The reality is, though, no offense to her, school counselors were already helping kids figure out what they need to do in order to get to college. We just weren't doing it very well. Why do kids go to school? They go to school to prepare them for the next level and the next level and ultimately to go to college. But now we have language around that. There are some policy changes that have been made. There's some criticism that came from a grant funded by Bill Gates that said school counselors are practically, we're not doing anything. And that students aren't actually coming to the school counselor, with few exceptions. Black children were going to the school counselor to talk about college more than they were talking to their parents. So that's a huge data point. But nonetheless, so there's this Reach Higher initiative, and what's the point of school? It's because education pays. So when you look at these demographics that are kind of fuzzy based on where you're sitting, at the far end we have all men and women. And then the far right are those with degrees beyond a bachelor degree. And you see that's the highest mark across the board. Now, the very other end of the spectrum are the Asian, and I find this very fascinating. Now that it has really anything to do with the conversation directly, but that Asian females with an advanced degree make $70,000 a year, and that's actually higher than all the men with advanced degrees in this country. Pretty fascinating when you look at the data. But the whole point here is education pays. If you look at the other end where you see less than a high school degree, back to the Asian women, there weren't enough folks in that category to even capture that data point, which is fascinating. But you can see that bar of the graph is the lowest. So without a high school diploma, you're now in a pretty bad place. I like to think outside of just these stats, and you could say, well, this was 4 years ago, so things have changed. We're preparing kids now for jobs that don't exist. So are we doing a good job in higher ed to prepare them for jobs that don't exist? I'm not really sure. I think a part of the counter culture, or I'm not sure exactly how I would say this, but if a kid grows up now with a Chromebook in Marana School District and he or she is this big and they're learning how to do this work on their own, but we're still teaching them like this, there's a disconnect here. Do they even need to go to school? I heard a kid tell me in DC, why do I need to memorize these facts when I can just Google it? So we can think about, well, education, we know it pays. We just got to think, how are we going to get involved in this conversation as things continue to change? But schools are slow to change. So this is where we are at this point. Here's another one in terms of unemployment rates. So if you have a bachelor's degree, you should be able to find a job. If you're a black person with a bachelor's degree, you still might be unemployed. There are a number of folks with bachelor's degree, according to this graph, who are unemployed. But the segment of the population for African Americans is like 15%. So 6.3 of the 15% that fit into that category, that's a lot. That it says here it's approximately 70% more than the 3.7% of the white folks who have a bachelor's degree and are unemployed. That's terrible. But nonetheless, this is what we have to work from. You need to go to school, because without having those tools, you won't be able to find a job. Take a look at here. SNAP is now food stamps, essentially. I point this one out because it breaks my heart doing the work in the public schools, even pretty good school districts, not just in DC, but here. And I'm taking my time building relationships and trying to get to know the lay of the land. But I'll show this here, that school lunches are not healthy. I mean, they're healthy in theory, but have you seen them lately? Right? There's some things they send that you don't know what it is. Like, you look at it, and right, and it breaks my heart, right? And I know I'm smiling, but it's true. Did you know that we count a juice box as a fruit item? I don't believe that's right. So if you're living in poverty and you have no choice, sure, it's food and kids are fine with it and so forth, but I wouldn't eat it and I wouldn't feed it to my children. So education pays. Here's the last one graph, and the rest are a few more stats. And this one's related to college access. So fortunately, we're doing better overall. There's been a lot of policy changes, and we have working with 2-year schools, right, where we're trying to get kids to go there, and then they can transition to a 4-year institution and so forth. And we try to make that easier. But here you see back in this side is, I think it's 1974 to 2011. And so overall, the trend is growing. For kids who just left high school, they're going to college at a greater rate than they were before. It says here 70% of the white students now in 2011 graduate from high school and go straight to college. 66% of the black kids graduate and go straight to college, and 62% for the Hispanic students. But then this graph down here, you have where 18 to 24-year-olds, so they didn't just graduate necessarily, but they're in this other range. And there's a gap there. 44% for the white students. I think it's 38% for the black students, and 31.5% for the Hispanic students. Again, what's not captured here is the fact that this percentages of black students and Latino students only make up 15% and 18% of the population. So that's what we're drawing from. And unfortunately, 2% of the black kids and about 1.5% of the Hispanic children, individuals, are incarcerated. So they're not even counted. So there's another gap. Only 0.2% of the white kids are incarcerated. So we know that demographic of our jails and prison system is a pipeline. So put another way, out of every 100 white kindergarten students, 94 graduate from high school, 66 complete some college, and 34 get a bachelor's degree. And for the Latino children, 62% graduate from high school, 31 complete at least some college, and 10 get a bachelor's degree. Another way, for every 100 students in the U.S. that begin ninth grade, 67 will finish high school in 4 years, 38 will go on to college, and only 18 will earn an associate's degree within 3 years, or a bachelor's in 6 years. And the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes. We haven't talked about first generation college students or any of these things, some generic stats. Yet, only half of the Black and Latino ninth graders graduate from high school in 4 years. So the longer it takes. Have you been to a public school where you have a ninth grader who's 17 years old? It happens. Or an eighth grader who should be in 11th grade, but they're in 8th grade because of their educational background. It's very challenging. They don't necessarily make it through high school. So what can school counselors do? So we're all educators to some extent in this room, and we understand the importance of education. School counselors do a number of things. We do individual counseling, where a kid comes into the office and we actually do counseling. Now, the counseling is not, tell me how you feel, and here's my theoretical orientation, and I'm going to give you some strategies and see me in a week. It's not like that. You're likely on the computer saying, what's your problem? You need to hurry up and you need to get back to class. Right? But we still do that. That's individual counseling. We go into classrooms and we teach lessons. And we teach lessons at the lower level. We teach lessons on social skills and character education and so forth. But at the middle and the high school level, we're teaching now college knowledge. Right? We're trying to do a better job of that. Teaching them how to fill out the FAFSA form. There have been some data, thanks to Michelle Obama, that there's a direct link between folks who actually just complete the FAFSA form. And not just complete it, but hit submit. Because sometimes you get to the bottom and they don't hit submit. And there's a direct correlation between that and folks actually going to college. So we teach classroom lessons. We also do group counseling. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. We do parent workshops. We may broker parent-teacher conferences. We might go on field trips. We might do bus duty. We might do lunch duty. We build schedules. A new kid might come from Pakistan and had physics when he was in 8th grade, but now he's a sophomore, and what are we supposed to do with that? Because folks in our school don't take physics until 11th or 12th grade. So school counselors have to figure out, and it's a very powerful job to be able to do that. We may have students, we might sign students up for AP courses. We have to educate parents on the trajectory of math, that if your student's not taking high-level algebra, before they leave the 8th grade, they're on a different trajectory. Because if you don't have algebra, by the time you're in 8th grade, then you can never get to the advanced level math. Some schools don't take students if they haven't had a math level beyond Algebra 2. But parents don't always understand that. So school counselors have a lot of things that they're doing in addition to what I'm saying they should be doing along the way. So we talk now about equity and how school counselors can use this modality of group work to level the playing field. We all are like individuals. We're all one person. And I don't know about you, but if it wasn't for mentors through school and supportive environments, and now even mentors in the academy, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be successful. If this is called success, right? No offense. It just depends on some days. But the fact is, I'm one person. And so the impact that we can make in one person's life, that's a pretty big deal. Now, I know that some folks do secondary data analysis, huge, and it's policy. It transforms, it changes policy, and we need that. But make no mistake, a great teacher or school counselor in an environment that makes an impact in a kid's life could be the seed that really makes a difference, because the literature says all you need is one connection in a school to make a student feel important, and therefore he or she is now able to ward off some of the other risk factors that are in schools. And I hate to say this too, but our current public schools are full of risk factors. They're not environments that I see kids running to be at. They can't wait to get there, or that they're so happy walking through the hallway. I don't really feel that it's that way. Now, it's a generalization, but those are some of my observations. So group work, we can help students have conversations about their intersecting identities. You might say, well, what about a third grader? Well, in their own language, they can have these conversations. We can use group counseling to help students begin to understand the knowledge and skills they need to solve their own problems. That's what I like about counseling more so than, say, psychotherapy. Counseling is about wellness. What are the strengths you have on the inside of yourself that we can build upon in order to help you reach your goals? Without me, you'll still be able to make it potentially. My job is to help you understand what some of those things are in your life. And then, maybe this is repetitive, we want to use group work to build on the students' strengths instead of focusing solely on their deficits. So here, I'd like to show you, before I describe a model that is being developed, early Mr. Steen doing group work with kids. This is a group of third graders who are considered ADHD, and you'll be able to tell when you see them interacting. This young man that you can see the square center of his back, his father was on the school board, and he said, please find video recorded because you're using it for training, but don't put it on my kid's face. Just FYI. I'm like, no problem, I got you covered. And the last thing, the teachers did not mind these kids coming here because they had ADHD. So they're like, if they're out of sight, they're out of my mind. You deal with them. And this was the beginning of a session. They had just got there. We were reviewing and just having conversations about how things are going. And this is just one snapshot of conversation. Hopefully you can hear it.
Boys and girls, boys, have you seen your behavior change any from the last time we met with Miss Hardy?
Yes, kind of.
Kinda, thank you.
A lot.
A lot?
A lot.
Here?
Kind of.
Kinda, a lot. Do you understand the question?
I'm reminding
You've seen a change in your behavior every day since the last time we met?
I'm reminding Chad and Robbie and Nick sometimes.
Are you reminded? That's very good.
What? I reminded you. You never reminded me.
You go to the class.
No. I also told you the supermodel.
Oh, yeah.
No, you didn't.
Chris,
Yeah,
did you
dude.
remind both Chad and Robbie?
Oh, he reminded me.
You
I know I
reminded
reminded Nick, but I know. I think, yeah, I did at least once for Robbie.
Garrett, say that louder.
Maybe,
Say what you said. Just tell me what you said.
I'm trying
Tell
to
him.
So what you discussed?
Robbie, I think you need to be honest. Maybe he thinks he's embarrassed that it's what?
Is there anything wrong with being reminded, Garrett? No.
Garrett, I'm proud of you for saying that.
Yes, I did.
You're
I
right,
don't get
that's- well, you're
embarrassed.
getting cheated.
I only get embarrassed when I'm on stage in front of over 100 people. I do not get embarrassed easily, and you should not remind.
Robbie,
Yes, I did.
listen to what just happened here.
I'm proud of Garrett.
Garrett's goal is to be more self-confident. He was afraid to tell you what he just said, weren't you, Garrett?
Yeah.
But you told him anyway. Do you know by telling him how you felt was being more confident? You recognize that?
Yeah.
What did you say to him?
I said he needs to be honest. I won't be embarrassed, and he just be honest.
Are we just trying to help each other out?
Yes.
Let's give Garrett.
All right, Garrett. Good job, Garrett. That's awesome.
Okay, so when this happened, this model wasn't completed. I just was bringing kids together. We were trying to focus on goals and some things we could work on. But I learned enough in graduate school that it's not getting through the curriculum that's so important, but it's the environment that's conducive to have conversations. And notice, we didn't focus on the kid who was upset because that would be a deficit approach. We focused on the kid's strengths, like, hey, you did this, it was one of your goals, and we're trying to encourage you to build on that. Here's another clip with 5th grade girls. Now, we ran 3 girls groups that year, and this one I was leading by myself. Probably not the most qualified at the time. I'm a little bit better now, and I listen a little better than I did back then. But I just want you to observe what the students are saying in this environment and why I believe the opportunity to bring kids together and have these conversations are so important. And I hope you can hear this one.
If I were to say to you, let's make a list of qualities about ourselves. Okay. So the question is this, let's make a list of qualities about ourselves. What comes to mind? So right here we have, for them, they're pretty, their hair is nice, they wear jewelry, nails, they get up early in the morning, they're skinny. Some are too skinny, it's not being good, they are beautiful. Their teeth are too white, but give me qualities about yourself. for example,
Dude, that was me though. Like, I know something to know.
okay, does that question make you uncomfortable when I ask you that? So give me a quality about yourself.
Yes.
It says it makes you uncomfortable. Why is that good?
I don't know.
So for you, Emily, maybe not your hair.
I don't like my hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like my hair. My hair is always all hair.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Hold on, stop. You think, say that again?
I think I'm too skinny, even though like I'm not on a diet or anything.
Yeah.
So, like when I get a lot of exercise and stuff, I think I need to put weight on.
Okay, so you feel like you're too skinny, even though you're naturally like that. So yeah, hair too skinny. You feel like that. Stop right there. Hold on. Stay focused for 1 minute. So you think you're too fat, and you said me too. Tell us more about that.
Well, ever since I quit gymnastics, like I haven't been working out.
Do you really feel fat, or do you feel like fatter than before, or do you feel like literally when you say I'm fat?
I made myself here.
Let me hear her.
Growing bigger. Like, just like I feel fat when I look in the mirror. I say I'm fat.
Okay, you're smiling when you say that. So are you smiling because you're kidding, or are you smiling because you really mean that? Because you feel uncomfortable when you think about it? Have you ever shared that with anybody else before? What did they say?
Like parents are just trying to make you happy.
Okay, stop right there. Do you all think she's fat?
No.
I mean, even a little bit?
No.
Okay. I'm sorry. Emily says that she's fat.
So I know when you heard that, I know what you're gonna say. You never ask a woman, do you think she's fat? I know. And the women could have said, either pause, like, if we say so, because the girl was very, very petite, and she was a gymnast, but stopped doing gymnastics and felt like she was gaining weight because she hadn't been working out. But it was ridiculous to me, and again, I didn't know, I should have had a woman co-leading it with me, but I did the best I could. So when we said, do you think she's fat, or even a little bit, imagine if the kids paused and didn't say anything, or if they hesitated, or maybe said, well, it depends, right? Because it's all relative. But nonetheless, the environment was there, and the peer voice is much louder than mine, even though I'm trying to facilitate and have conversations with these kids. So ideally, this work is strength-based. And I mentioned this earlier, where we're trying to empower students and families and colleagues to engage in this work, right? But also to help the students discover the power within themselves, their families, and their neighborhood. And then also, rather than focusing on their deficits or labels or issues, we want to help them understand the resources and the connections that they can make in their world, and the skills and the gifts that they have. So that leads to the group model I've been developing. So those two clips you saw were pre the model, but it informed the model. And also, while I was pursuing a PhD for the pay raise, I had the opportunity to go and give a presentation at a national conference. My advisor said, what are you doing? What's going on for you in your school setting? I told him I was doing group counseling, and he said, oh, you should write about that. And he's the type of guy, no offense, he's a white male, and he's like, oh yeah, piece of cake, just do that. You know how sometimes say, oh, it's no big deal. And I'm like, okay, no problem, I can do that. Because he said it, I can do it. So I had this mentoring, like, the sky's the limit. So I go there and present and meet these people who wrote the textbooks and got encouragement. Again, the mentoring part I mentioned before. And some critique. And the more and more you do something, the better it becomes. So my dissertation was in 2007. And then I wrote a study about the model by myself in order to get tenure, right? I had to be able to show that I could do it on my own. So I did that. But I realized that there's strength in collaboration. So from that point, I've been collaborating with folks. Because how do we gain access to school districts? It's very challenging to do this work. So it's called the ASE group model. There are a few studies that are on the next page. But really, if you do the summary of what's going on here, I wanted to demonstrate that I could do group work in school settings that fit into the way schools already operate. We have cool people coming from the outside, coming in saying, hey, you need to do this initiative. And if you're an educator or a teacher, it's just something on top of what you're already doing, and it becomes more complicated. But here, I was a school counselor for a long time. And then also had the opportunity, even as an academic, to go back to be a school counselor as a long-term sub. When someone retired, they would call and ask, and I love to do it. And even before I left DC, I was a ninth grade high school counselor in one of the most prestigious high schools in the District of Columbia, which was located right on the GW campus. So no offense to GW, but I got the park right on campus, right on it's called the School Without Walls, and it's literally next door. And I park my car right there. I get out, walk to my office. People are like, what a hustle you had, Dr. Steen. It wasn't that. It's that I made a commitment. Some people set up a clinic, and some people do other things. I made a commitment to get back to the school, and it just so happened to be there. So this is really important to me, that this group work would fit into the normal professional role of school counselors. But there are some critiques out there. So we have to have a control group. But when you're doing real work with real kids and you think the intervention works, why would you have a control group? Why would you withhold this treatment from those kids? But we have to do it anyway, so what we do is a wait list. So we withhold it the first semester, and then we do it, offer it to them in the spring, so we figure that part out. But the sample sizes are too small. And that one I struggle with, because you do need larger ends in order to really show some statistical significance. But we also were able to show statistical significance in this work with large effect or treatment effect sizes. But the way I see it is, even if one kid benefits from the group, then we're doing something. Because, like I said, person. And although this work is difficult, I like to continue to engage in the work because I think it'll make a difference. So if you start from the bottom and work your way up, these are some papers that I wrote, and then I've written with my colleagues. So the first one here at the very bottom, Integrating Academic Interventions, Counseling with Elementary, that stemmed from those conversations I had with the young women, the young men, and then a clip that we may get to with a group of African American children. Dr. Ballman and I wrote the second paper, Professional School Counselors and the Practice of Group Work, and the one not above it, but the one above that one, the Preparation of Professional School Counselors for Group Work. We wrote that together. I met Dr. Ballman, Sherry Ballman, who's been here for a while, 10 years ago. And I sent out 3 emails to all these experts. My advisor said, send out these emails to experts to get their feedback. I think I told you all this. And before I hit send, Dr. Bowman responded, right? That you all know, right? But the other 2, crickets. I didn't hear anything from them. So she's been instrumental in that. This third one, I wrote with my advisor. We implemented process-oriented groups similar to the ASE model with high school kids. And what I learned there is that you need food if you want to get kids to talk. That's it. That was it. They didn't need me. They didn't need him. It was just the food. And once they got there, they challenged each other. Well, they also talked about MySpace at the time. That's dating myself a little bit. You remember that, right? MySpace? Y'all probably never heard of that, but MySpace. They talked about that. But then they also talked about using drugs and not listening to their parents and the sexual activity they were engaging in. And all we did is simply brought snacks and some soda, and they had those conversations, and we helped facilitate them. Moving up, I had to write a paper by myself again. So this one, Group Counseling for African American Elementary Students, I wrote that one. And the funny thing about this story is I wrote this story, and it was about integrating literacy into group work, where you use culturally relevant books written by black people for the black students. Some of the black kids I was working with didn't really see themselves as black because the community we lived in was largely white. So they didn't really even understand that part. So assumptions I made. And the other part that's pretty comical to me is, I think I had my PhD at this point in time. I sent it to my father, and he's, I say, hey, Dad, I want you to read this. You're a black man, and you go to a Baptist church, and I want you to read this. So he read it. I didn't hear anything from him. 3 months later, I asked him about it. He's like, oh, yeah, I read it. He's like, I didn't understand a word you were talking about in that story. So then it dawned on me not to just write for the sake of publication, but how you write in a way that people can understand and actually use it. This man's a deacon in a black Baptist church, and he didn't understand what I was saying in this paper. It was a problem. Then you move on to the work where it involved ESL students and how we began to integrate academic and personal social development. So ESL students in Virginia don't receive a lot of counseling. There's often an ESL teacher who's doing that work, but they're ill prepared to actually do the other parts. They're great, they're very supportive, they can educate them, but we were able to bring the students together and ask them about things other than just academic development, but also the personal challenges that they were experiencing in the schools, and to build on that work. The academic and personal development through group work was actually my dissertation. So it took, I don't know how many years. That's 2011. I graduated in 2007. It took 4 or 5 years to actually write my dissertation up. But the dissertation was 5 school counselors in the school district who implemented this model. And so although it took a long time to actually publish that work, it was important for me to be able to do that, to say that this work is legitimate and it has a place in the field. And then the last 3 are where we are at this point. These 3 projects are implementing this model intentionally, trying to utilize the curriculum that we developed. And there are 2 studies underway that aren't up here. One is in West Virginia with an Appalachian population, and one in the Marana School District with rural students who have been a part of the foster care system. And we're trying to see if we can broaden the populations that we serve. Therefore, we'll be able to say it's an evidence-based curriculum. And you know what that means. It should have an N of 2,000 and it doesn't, but I'm working on it. So this model, the rationale is that school counselors can engage in this work. We already have access to students. We already have all these other things we're supposed to be doing, but we can target the most at-risk students in the school. I get pushback on this. Every school, public school, generically speaking, has a population of at-risk students. I say it's roughly 10%. So if you have a school with 100 kids, it's 10. 1,000 kids, it's 100. Well, I'll just throw out high school. Every high school counselor around October will start getting information on the kids who are failing certain classes. That begins some of your at-risk student population, so who's struggling academically. So we can target those students, because again, the other students without our support, our active Tier 3 intervention, they're gonna be okay. They're not gonna fall through the cracks. I mean, they could, but I'm just saying, this is my perspective. They're not gonna fall through the cracks. So we can target primarily those kids to help them enhance their social-emotional development, to help them understand and improve their academic-related behaviors. Raising your hand in class makes a difference. Turning in your homework makes a difference. Asking questions with the teacher when everybody's going off to recess or lunch, it makes a difference. And then, ultimately, we're trying to help contribute to their success in the classroom. So how does it work? Well, it provides structure so that we can do the counseling part, like, hey, tell me how you're feeling, and really hear and listen, but also teach you some things that maybe you didn't know about, or to hip you to the idea that you're in this category. I mean, okay, so a funny story is the first time I had a group of black boys that were 4th grade and talked about, you know, you're an at-risk population. They're like, what are you talking about? Right? You know that if you don't get the intervention right now, you're on a trajectory that might not make it. What are you talking about? So you also have to be real intentional about the language you use. I was using like this language, I thought that was appropriate. But the idea to help them understand that some of the things you're experiencing is not your fault. It's not because you're lazy. It's not because you're not trying hard enough. It's not because you will never understand how to read. But there's some other things around in the system that might be hindering you from being successful. So it provides a structure to do both of those. School counselors can teach students how to address their personal concerns, how to address their academic difficulties, and explore career goals, which is a major push now. And then also we can help students identify and build on those assets I talked about. So there are the internal assets that we all have, those are your gifts and talents. But then what are some of the assets, if we're lucky, in the community? They all have them, but they're not always robust. Have you ever tried to find a decent restaurant that you would take your family to in Southeast DC? And at the time, there was only a Denny's and the Giant. And the Giant is where people would go and eat the food that was cooked in the grocery store. So that's not necessarily an asset in the community, but you need to find where they are in order to help the kids to recognize them so they can get what they need. So there are 6 phases to this model, and they fall in these categories here: assessment, review, acquaintance, challenge, empowerment, and support. And this table right here helps explain it a little bit more in depth. So this is not a curriculum, but there is a curriculum that's associated with this work. And the curriculum is loose. I call it a model so that if you want to build in resiliency, that's your focus. If you want to teach something particular around identity development, that would be your focus. But here, on the left-hand side are the phases. And so here's where the data comes into play. So the school counselors are asked to collect data to show that their work is making a difference. So now, why not collect data on the students? But don't only collect the data from the students, also collect the data from the teacher. And what I found is even just asking a teacher to reflect on the kid makes a difference. Because the teacher starts to reflect on the kid, okay, he or she's terrible, he or she's terrible, but then now they're receiving an intervention. Wait a minute, maybe something is changing because I'll send an email or put a postcard in their mailbox and say, hey, you should have heard what Johnny said today. So now the teacher maybe will begin to think differently. But not only that, the teacher can describe what is he or she seeing in the classroom that maybe we can talk about in these sessions. But not just from the teachers and the students, also the families. Tell me what's going on. Sometimes kids act a fool at home, but they're so good in school, or vice versa. They're like, what do you mean you can get them to do that? We're never able to get the kid to read a book or to go to bed at this certain time. So the data from the families is also critical. And then the students, school counselors, take this information and they build the sessions around that data rather than just saying, I'm going to bring a curriculum in and these are the conversations we're going to have. Those are not as relevant as using specifically the data. After the data is collected, you've had a conversation with your administration and your teachers and your team. Then you meet with the kids, the students, and you explain to them, here's what we're going to do. Are you interested or not? You try to get the buy-in because if they say no, you might already have a problem. If you say yes, we're going to have snacks, and although you're going to miss your recess, it might be pizza there, or the incentive might be a UA t-shirt or something like that, then maybe they're inclined to want to come. But then we begin with the sessions where you sit down and you review with them, why are you here? Why are you even in school? What are some goals you have individually? What are some goals we can build and work on together? And how can we utilize this to help us all? That's typically pretty early on. Then you move to the acquaintance phase. Here in counseling, it's the most critical data point in terms of successful therapy is the relationship between the therapist and the client. If it's not there, there's a disconnect, it won't happen. In cross-cultural interactions, if you don't explore or broach those issues, it won't work. If you're male, female, and vice versa, and you don't broach, what's it like being with a male, counseling with a male, or and so forth? What's it like being a woman and often being viewed in this way? If you have those conversations, then it strengthens the relationship. The same thing in a group dynamic. If you explain to the students, here's our role, here's how we're going to work together, and you do activities on who are you? Where you come from, where'd your name come from, what's your cultural background, and so forth, it strengthens the opportunity to lead to the next two phases, which is the most unique aspect, I think, of the model, is challenging kids to do better than they have been doing, to confront them on things that won't help them be successful, to provide an environment for them to talk about things and have conversations that maybe they've not had anywhere else. It's hard for a teacher to stop and reflect with a kid, what's going on for you? I'm sorry to hear that's going on in your life. It doesn't really happen. There's not enough time. But counselors can do that work. And then that leads, because the peers are doing it, to the empowerment phase where we now have exposed what some of these difficulties are, but now we teach them. And if it's beyond the scope of my ability to teach them about writing essays for college applications, we can have guest speakers come in. Or if you need a male or female engineer from a certain demographic, then bring them in to have conversations about those things that you might not be able to do. So build on the assets in the community. And then we have these conversations, we challenge them, we highlight that there are some oppressive environments that we're living in, but it's okay, you do have the strengths to overcome these challenges. And then unfortunately, the groups have to end, because the semester is moving, the school year is going on. That goes back to my conversations about treatment and control groups, or the idea that how do we just put this in the midst of what's going on. So this last phase here is something that we developed over time where we call them reunions. So 12 sessions, it's done, but we let the students know in 3 weeks we're going to meet back together and reflect on how's it going. Or let's say you were in a divorce group and we emphasize the change in family or a loss of a loved one, like a grief group. You can ask to bring us all back together and tell us how it's going. So things have changed or things are still difficult, but we can support one another. But also linking them. So if we come together once a week for 12 weeks, and if you've ever participated, they call them tea groups back in the day. You know, you grow a lot, or you've been to a retreat and you're there, you refresh, and you make friends, and then you leave. You kind of get sad. So we try to link them up with other programs. So can we hook them up with the YMCA? Or maybe they play soccer, or maybe they'll join the Glee Club they wouldn't have done in the past. Talk to the teachers in the school to help them understand, hey, these are some students that could use some additional support. They're too afraid to start the LGBTQI plus club. Can you help them? And so forth. And that has been instrumental in sustaining some of this growth over time. So we just about ran out of time, but I'd like to show you maybe one more clip. I could show you a few more that are quite funny, but I'll show you one more. And these, I would say, are case examples of where we're trying to be more culturally relevant with these fourth graders, and they're all African American kids. I have one with all Latino kids, but it's hard to hear, so I'll skip that one. And then maybe you had some questions that you wrote down, and we'll have a few conversations. So a summary of all this work over the years, it's not something that I just started one day. It's something that I made a commitment to make it relevant and applicable in school settings. I hope to keep building a larger population in which to be able to say that it impacts. But generally speaking, the students, they have a better understanding of their strengths, a clearer picture of what it takes to be successful in U.S. schools, and the benefit of reading and understanding that it's important to develop their language skills. A network of support that they can get inside their community and inside themselves that is linked to success. Their grades go up in small ways. We may concentrate primarily on English and math, but those are critical indicators of school success. Higher levels of self-concept and self-esteem, a better chance at adjusting to school life. That stemmed directly from the program or project we did in DC, where the students had only been in the US for less than 1 year. And 2 bilingual counselors implemented the work, and they found that their achievement didn't grow so much, but their school adjustment scores did. And that made a difference because they felt more comfortable in the school environment. And over time, they'll do better in the classroom. And then also having a conversation about the barriers and challenges, and then collectively deciding how we're going to fix that. So maybe one more you want to see?
Game of my life.
How about this one?
Because
Are you all listening to each other?
It's still bad counseling, but we're going to listen.
I have family members in Washington.
Oh, Jordan. I thought you said Georgia.
Hey! I have family members in Washington.
I have cousins. They're in Africa. They're about to drive up to Japan.
So we have.
I'm going to Tokyo.
Drive to bring up from Africa.
I don't think you can drive.
You like drive here for 2 trials.
I want to do the
Boys and
Or
girls.
take a spell.
Listen. Will somebody ask AJ what's wrong with him? Because I already asked.
What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? I don't want.
Hold on, one at a time. Because we need to.
What's wrong with you? What? You have something on your mind.
He just wants to be outside playing basketball. I know the feeling.
I do.
But think about it.
go to sleep.
We've always met on Mondays. Yes or no?
No, he
Have we always met on Mondays?
Yes.
He doesn't care about
No,
girls.
except Tuesday.
One day Shelby wasn't here. But think about it, boys and girls. Remember the day we met on the Tuesday? Yeah,
Oh yeah.
But it's been the same way, right, AJ? Your mom asked, you said, Mr. Steen, I think it's good for him. Do you all think it's helpful that you come here? I saw some of the grades, so I think it's helpful.
I got mine.
You think it helped you?
Straight A's. I got mine.
I've been A+ on my life.
Boys, did you get, girls, did you hear that?
Yeah.
Minus?
I got 2 A+.
Did you hear?
2 A pluses and a -0 on what test?
I got an A. I got B plus.
Oh, me too.
I got an A plus.
Study.
That's hard. I got an A
Virginia
plus.
Studies.
I got
I got an A and Virginia studies. I got.
Congratulations. AJ was not getting -0 on Virginia Studies. Did you know that? You've been working hard? Did you
I've
study?
been getting like mine.
Let's hear. We have 2 things.
I got
left.
A. I got A
Focus
plus.
with me.
I got A plus on Virginia studies.
Congratulations, Malia. I'll give you one more.
When people
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at AJ because he's helping the club and he really wants to go outside. Tell me, Abdul.
I want to and one person.
Oh, there you go.
Two or one people like take me for getting it up. So I ignore them sometimes and say I don't really care about it. So I just walk away.
Good job.
I know
Let's
one
give him a
person
hand.
is
That's
valid.
good. Good job, Abdul. Abdul, you hear what Abdul said?
Yeah,
What did he say, Cameron?
like some people think you're gonna get held back.
And then what did he do
And
though?
then you just ignore them.
And walk away.
How was that?
He has to repeat 4th grade. Boys and girls, take a pick. Richard Wright.
Richard Wright and the actually Richard Wright. Oh, Richard
Yeah,
Wright.
what do we have? What do you think, Shelby?
I don't care.
Which
Me
one?
neither. I don't know.
Actually, Richard Wright in the library.
Okay, what do you think? Kennedy? Malik?
Award winner.
This one? AJ?
Award winning.
What do you think, Abdul? So,
Mamma Mia.
so you see there that even the boy, the young man who didn't really want to be there, as soon as we asked which book you want to read, he was the first one to respond. So even still, the environment is set up in a way where it's okay if they're out of their seat. It's okay if they're moving around because schools are hard. You gotta sit, I see half of you falling asleep. You know, you gotta sit there and like, focus for an hour. It's a very tough to do, right? It's very challenging to do. But in this case, it's okay if we let them do that so that they can then go back and really engage in the work. So I think that's enough for one day. Here, what are some things that we discussed that might be useful? What are some things that surprised any of you? What are some other questions that you may have about this work? So before we engage in conversation, we have like 10 or 12 minutes. On the back side, remember there's one side I asked you to write down what you hope to learn. On the back side, maybe something that you did learn. That's my data. I'll take that with me. It's like a form of a pre and a post test. And then those questions that you have, you can either ask them now or you can pass them up here before you leave. And maybe I can answer a few of them. Melissa. You have a question?
Oh, I do have one comment on something that's really useful for me. I'm going to be a counselor for people with varying disabilities.
Yeah.
So that you put high expectations as an external asset alongside like a supportive adult is as much of an asset as a supportive adult. I thought was really interesting and valuable and just learning how to like get the bar just within reach or higher.
Exactly. As opposed to walking around saying, "Oh, sorry, you have these challenges, you can't do it." Yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, I was in 7th grade and a math teacher said to me, "Are you Steve Steen's brother?" And I was like, "Yeah." And this was in Germany, even though I told you I had a great experience. And she says, "Well, I hope you're not as dumb as your brother." So that expectation was already kind of shot down. Later, my mom told me why she was so hard, because he and a buddy made her cry in classroom. So no offense to her, but nonetheless, who does that? So the idea that we would encourage kids, you can be successful. And you're right, to push them just beyond their ability. Were you going to ask a question too, or you just
Or just comment on that would be
Yeah,
useful.
thanks. Other thoughts or reactions or comments about what? Sure.
So I'm curious, you talked about a couple of the different groups like types of students that you've worked with. Other than the example with the students that level ADHD, like what other disabilities or how inclusive are the groups that you're working with? Are there students on IEPs or 504 plans? Or
Yeah, it's both. So I've done it, not using the model though, you mean just group work, right?
Or no, and the model.
The model, no, they haven't been intentionally students identified with an IEP. It hasn't been like that. It has been where we would say, like the one where, how long have you been in the country? So that was one indicator. Or are you struggling academically? That was another indicator. In ninth grade, we did it with ninth graders where they had failed 2 courses at the end of the first 9 weeks, and we targeted them. If they had an IEP, it wasn't something that we really discussed. We have done group interventions that were mixed. Sometimes I would go into the classroom and actually run group intervention with a self-contained class. They were already smaller classes, so we had those conversations in there using the skills we learned in our master's program. And then there are other times like this group, everyone in there, although they had ADHD, they didn't all have IEPs. That's just what we called it, which was a little bit inappropriate to say the ADHD group. I can't remember if we called it like the bubblegum group or something else. We were trying to be sneaky about it, but really, those were the kids who the teachers thought were always off task. So I hope I answered your question. No, we haven't targeted students with disabilities with this model yet, but there's definitely an opportunity if it's something that would be of interest to collaborate.
How do you see your model extending into the community with folks who are not counselors? And I ask this just because at a recent conference, I did a presentation on youth participatory action research.
Yeah.
It's a lot of the same principles. And some school counselors were in the audience, which was great, and they asked, well, how do we implement this into our school? And so I'm really interested in bridging that gap between counselor education and some of the work that we do here in primary studies.
I think my answer would be if, let's say, we're a school counselor and we see the benefit of the group work. The groups extend beyond school settings. And so another piece of our work when I was teasing about scheduling and bus duty are to build partnerships. So certainly one counselor with a caseload of 800 or however many can't do everything, but we can make these partnerships and make the link. So one would be through university school partnerships and so forth. But I would say it would just be a matter of actually having conversations and then getting involved in the work. But recognizing that we have to extend beyond just the school. And that's why I talk about the asset building. What are the assets in the community? One of which could be partnerships. What else? Feel free to read from your card if it's on there if you want to just read that one. Sure.
I have a question. Where can we get the curriculum? Or like, how do we find it?
Yeah, no, I have it now, and it's, I didn't want to try to publish it yet, so I've just been giving it away.
Okay.
And I literally got an email yesterday. It was so encouraging. Someone who's a student and also a community counselor in maybe Idaho, and said, hey, I came across this work. Where can I buy it? Is it online? And I was like, oh, that was so encouraging, knowing that I was going to come here. And it just happened yesterday. I told him I'll send it to you, but I haven't published it yet. I've talked to 2 publishing companies, but I just wanted to wait to have enough data so that it wouldn't have so many holes in it, because often people want to know, has it been tested? And so what's the theory of change? And school counselors, unfortunately, we don't go around talking about theory of change. We talk about what's on my agenda for today, which fires do I need to put out? And so the empowerment focus and the strength-based is the theory has changed. But to answer your question directly, just email me. I'll send it to you. There's no problem. It's free of charge. I'm always looking to collect more data.
So your model reminds me a lot of the self-determination model. I'm not sure if you know what that, but it allows individuals to be autonomous, to be competency focused, and the ability to focus on model social interactions is kind of the which individuals feel bonded. And when they're bonded, they invest in what they do a little better. I just see a lot of similarities.
I'll look into it. I haven't studied. I've heard of it before, but I haven't really studied it to say. But what you're bringing up is an opportunity in the intro to say here are the theoretical underpinnings, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's great because what it seems like is happening is these students are feeling very connected and supported, and they're being encouraged. They're feeling they're bonding, right? Either to you or to the counselor or to their peers, and then having that connection at that school, right, is going to help them do better long term.
Exactly. Yeah, I appreciate that. Anything else? Sure.
Thank you for sharing your work. So actually, before I moved to U of A a couple years ago, I was on the faculty at Steen.
Oh yeah.
I worked closely. I was in the college of ed there. I worked closely with the school counselor.
Was Dr. Butler there? Kit Butler, was he there?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so. Kent State. I remember that. The irony of his name. And that's what I remember.
And we did a really intense study in one of the school districts near Cleveland that had like a 0 to 40% growth in the population of Latino students. And we're seeing some really just huge disparities between Latino students and white students and black students. Achievement, not surprising. And we took a very asset-based approach to the work and did some focus groups and a survey and some trainings for the teachers. And one of the things that we're finding in our work is that even when we focus and try to build assets in these interventions that my colleagues are still doing there, when they're interacting with teachers who are engaging in discrimination, it's very clear that the students are reporting on the surveys. It's not buffering
Dealt with.
that. So we're still seeing the negative impacts on academic achievement for those who are experiencing really high levels of discrimination from teachers. And I actually led one of the teacher trainings, and I was shocked by some of the pushback I was getting from the teachers. Like they were like, "Who are you to come in and tell me?"
That's right.
That
Imagine what they say to me.
Care about school.
Right.
Because that was like their big. That was their big bites. That all the teachers were late. There was one teacher who was even though the student population was 90%.
Yeah. So you're just reflecting on the challenges.
Right. But so how do we think about how do we think about this type of intervention when we still have teachers who are engaging in this very explicit covert and forms of discrimination?
I don't have an answer for that. I really don't. It goes back to the preparation before we get there, right? That we train them in these programs, counseling or teacher prep programs, before they get there so they're not caught off guard. But once they're in the field and they have the power and the door is shut, I'm amazed, like you're saying, at what they say to some of the students and some of the barriers that kids encounter. And that's why I say some of the school environments are deficit-driven themselves. So I really don't have a great answer for that other than don't stop trying. And exposing the kids to the reality that just because you're encountering these barriers doesn't mean you can't overcome them. Find another resource in order to be successful. We have time for one more. Anybody else?
So I just want to thank you all for coming. I think we can all agree we've found some wonderful counselors and some really challenging counselors out there. So it's good to know that there are models like this and ways to train future counselors or for people to kind of take some tools and implement it in their schools when they're interested. So thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you
Steen.
very much. If you don't mind, I'll take those cards. I'd love to have those in.
And if you're new to the Institute or Turbeville Speaker Series, pick up one of these on the way out and you can learn more about us. I still have chocolates left. Yeah, let me go grab them.
Yeah, just email me.
Yeah.